Hello everyone. Today's topic is which we will pay attention to disaster risk management and climate change adaptation, which contributed to many of the victims that we suffered, but there is also a way out, which we will consider today in this video. There will be explanations and solutions and examples. Enjoy watching.
What is disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation? Abstract. Disaster risk reduction and climate change are pressing fields of action for scholars, practitioners, and policymakers to promote a sustainable level of well-being for local communities and to increase the resilience of communities coping with multi-origin hazards. What is disaster risk adaptation? Adaptation means adjustment in a system's behavior and characteristics that enhance its ability to cope with external stresses. Adaptation will allow a system to reduce the risk associated with these hazards by reducing its social vulnerability. What are some adaptation strategies for climate change? There are 5 solutions that can both curb climate change and help us cope with its impact at the same time. The first one, protect coastal wetlands. The second, promote the benefits of sustainable agroforestry. Third, decentralize energy distribution. The first, secure indigenous people land rights. And the fifth, improve mass transit. What is adaptation in relation to climate change? Adaptation refers to adjustment in ecological, social, or economic system in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli and their effects or impacts. It refers to change in processes, practices, and structures to moderate potential damage or to benefit from opportunities associated with climate change. How can we manage the risk of climate change? Climate change risk management approaches generally fall into 4 broad categories. The first, mitigation efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And second, adaptation, increasing society capacity to cope with change in climate. The third, geoengineering or climate engineering, additional deliberate manipulation of the Earth system. And also, how can we reduce the risk of climate change? There are 5 ways to reduce the risk of climate change. Put a price on carbon. Cutting emissions starts with clear policy signals. Also, and fossil fuel subsidize or build low-carbon, resilient cities, increasing energy efficiency and use of renewable energy, implement climate-smart agriculture and nature forest landscapes. What is meant by the term disaster risk management? Disaster risk management is the application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new disaster risk, reduce the existing disaster risk, and manage residual risk, contribution to the strengthening of resilience and reduction of disaster losses. And strategy to prevent new disaster risk, reduce existing disaster risk, and manage residual risk, contribution to the strengthening of resilience and reducing of disaster losses. Is adaptation to climate change possible? Adaptation can be reactive, occurring in response to climate impacts, or anticipatory, occurring before impacts of climate change are observed. In most circumstances, anticipatory adaptation will result in lower long-term cost and be more effective than reactive adaptations.
What is the purpose of an adaptation? An adaptation is any heritable trait that helps an organism, such as a plant or animal, survive and reproduce in its environment. Many animals have developed specific parts of the body adapted to survive in a certain environment. Among them are webbed feet, sharp claws, whiskers, sharp teeth, large beaks, wings, and hooves. What are the factors of adaptation? Adaptation involves coping not only with the physical, abiotic environment, light, dark, temperature, water, wind, but also with the complex biotic environment, other organisms such as mates, competitors, parasites, predators, and escape tactic of prey. How does adaptation take place? Adaptation are the result of evolution. Evolution is a change in a species over long periods of time. Adaptation usually occurs because a gene mutates or changes by accident. Some mutations can help an animal or plant survive better than others in the species without the mutation. How can we manage climate change adaptation? Erecting buildings and infrastructure that is safer and more sustainable. Replanting forests and restoring damaged ecosystem. Diversifying crops so that they are better able to adapt to changing climates. Investigating and developing innovative solutions to prevent and manage natural catastrophes. How can we solve disaster problems? Nature-based solutions such as conserving forests, wetland and coral reefs can help communities prepare for cope with and recover from disasters, including slow onset events such as drought. They can also reduce the secondary impacts from non-climate related disasters such as landslides following an earthquake. How does climate change affect disaster risk? Climate change will therefore affect disaster risk in two ways. Firstly, through the likely increase in weather and climate hazard and effects of sea level rise. And secondly, through the increase in vulnerability of communities to natural hazard resulting from ecosystem degradation, reduction in water and food. How can we help natural disasters? Here are 5 of the most effective ways to help disaster victims. Donate to accredited disaster relief organizations. Plan a fundraiser. Send goods and supplies to loved ones in affected areas. Ship supplies into recovery and evacuated zones. And give the blood. What can you do to prepare for disaster in your community? How can you help others affected by disaster bravely? Evacuate before disaster strikes, if possible. If danger is imminent in your area, evacuate before it strikes. Prepare family members for what may happen. And the last, choose multiple meeting spots. Why is it necessary to learn disaster risk reduction and management? It helps us identify and map local capacities to cope with these hazards. Ultimately, the DRR approach helps us conduct effective disaster response while reducing risk that similar disaster will recur. It also ensures that our emergency response does no harm by replacing or reinstating critical vulnerabilities. What are the key steps in disaster risk reduction? The first, preparedness. Action is taken before a disaster happens to anticipate, forecast, or warn against hazards, and to put in place contingency planning and means to allow a community to respond to hazard. The second is mitigation. Any action taken to minimize the impact of a potential disaster. The action is normally done before the event and can involve structurally, like building a resistant infrastructure, and non-structural activities, like for example, community training in disaster risk management, sensitization session at school. And the last, third, prevention. Measures taken to avoid hazard and potential disaster. For example, access to water point during flooding, relocating the village to higher ground above flooding. Integration of food security and livelihoods sector in Burkina Faso. Since 2011, the Burkina Faso mission has been implementing a project to adapt to climate change while is combating the underlying causes of food and nutritional insecurity. The principal approach is a multi-sectoral approach which looks to improve livelihoods, develop the capacities of communities to adapt to climate crisis, and to restore access to community service in a sustainable way. In the intervention zone, agricultural product is dependent on the spatial temporal distribution of rainfall. The repetitive pockets of drought are more and more frequent and compromise the yield of crops. In addition to this erratic distribution of rainfall, the crop year cycles are shortening or moving with delayed starts or sudden stops of rainfall. In order to tackle these problems, water management and conservation, restoration of soil activities have been implemented through a participative approach involving the communities and local institutions. During the project, the communities are asked to contribute and set up a range of activities such as the development of land planning, such as improvement of degraded lands and rehabilitation of low lands. An example given as use of mechanized or manual tie technique, usage of vegetable gardens and reforestation, the protection of the river banks, vegetation, bound, and etc., the promotion and production of improved wood stoves, the promotion of cash transfers, rehabilitation and or construction of water points, the distribution of small livestock, the usage of improved and certified seeds, the organization of exchange visits for the discussion on good practices.